EDSA was the culmination of all our frustrations. It was the culmination of all our dreams as well. You know, it was the starting point.
I felt very confident at that time that we had the full support of the Filipino people.
And other people came in, and I was among the first to enter Camp Aguinaldo.
It was like a call to arms. Everybody said, come here. We went there.
They were all shouting on the radio, it is all this pandemonium, beautiful pandemonium.
We were attacked by tanks. The tanks approached us, but did not run over us.
It was a great shining moment for the Filipino people.
Have passed since the People Power Uprising of EDSA shook the Philippines and stunned the rest of the world. On February 22 to 26, 1986, millions of Filipinos swarmed into and overflowed a Metro Manila highway called EDSA. They toppled a dictatorship and restored democracy without shedding blood. They came on the call of the Roman Catholic Church to provide a human shield for an intrepid band of Malacanang Palace mutineers. The palace coup, which failed, was led by Defense Secretary Juan Ponce Enrile and joined a day after by Armed Forces of the Philippines Chief of Staff, Fidel Ramos. Target of the mutiny was the dictatorship of President Ferdinand Marcos. The mutineers fled to Camp Aguinaldo, headquarters of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. There they would say their last prayers and prepare to die. Soon, an army artillery barrage would wipe them out. This would have been the bloodiest massacre in Philippine history. The massacre never took place. Radio Veritas, broadcast network of the Catholic Church, rang with the voice of Jaime Cardinal Sin the night of February 22. He called on the people to come out, give the mutineers food, protect them from the Marcos dictatorship. That four-day revolt is now known the world over as People Power. It was contemporary history's first successful nonviolent uprising against the hated dictatorship. At the vanguard was the Yellow Army of President Corazon Aquino, repeatedly shouting, "Cory, Cory, Cory." She had just proclaimed herself victor in the snap presidential elections over President Marcos. When the beleaguered dictator finally ordered his generals to fire on the throngs of EDSA, they lost their nerve. They would have slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who had accused Marcos of rigging the snap elections to perpetuate himself in power. Advancing government tanks and army trucks full of soldiers came to a dead stop. Religious nuns, priests, and many others stood in their way. They offered the soldiers food, flowers, and peace. Top-ranked military officers and soldiers deserted the dictatorship and joined the EDSA uprising. In time, as a result of people power, other peoples in other countries would also surge in a human flood, replicating the passion of EDSA for democracy and against tyranny. Yan'an men in China shook with a revolting studentry against the communist dictatorship. The streets of Seoul, South Korea, teemed with an outraged studentry, joined by the middle class against the military dictatorship. Seoul's uprising against communist tyranny was also inspired by EDSA, and so were, to a substantial extent, the tidal waves of human protest in Czechoslovakia, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the sudden meltdown of communist rule in the countries of Eastern Europe. Eventually, the heartland of communism in the Soviet Union collapsed. The People Power Uprising at EDSA has certainly carved out a prominent niche in the hierarchy of revolutions in the 20th century. So impressed was President François Mitterrand of France that in 1989 he invited President Corazon Aquino to be the lone guest of state in the bicentennial of the French Revolution of July 14, 1789. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Let us hear what François Mitterrand has to say about EDSA and people power as he nears the end of his 14-year term as President of France.
Chers amis, lorsqu'en février 1986, les Philippines ont renoué avec la démocratie, la France a aussitôt fait connaître sa solidarité avec le peuple philippin et adressé à Madame Aquino, présidente légitime de son pays, ses vœux de réussite. D'autres pays occidentaux ont alors adopté la même attitude que nous. C'était bien le moment décisif où changeait le cours des choses. Depuis lors, j'ai reçu la présidente Aquino à Paris. Elle y est venue à l'occasion du bicentenaire de la Révolution française en 1989. Et c'était important pour moi et pour nous tous que d'avoir votre présidente parmi nous pour célébrer un pareil événement. Car nous nous intéressons aux Philippines qui nous paraissent pourtant si lointaines et à leur culture qui a contribué et qui continue de contribuer à la connaissance dans le monde. Je pourrais citer le festival Rendez-vous avec les Philippines qui a lieu à Paris et qui vient de s'achever après avoir connu un très grand succès. Je pourrais citer aussi la visite officielle en France au mois de septembre dernier, 1994, du président Ramos à l'occasion de l'ouverture à Paris de l'exposition consacrée au trésor de San Diego. J'ai pu m'entretenir avec lui des progrès de la démocratie au cours de ces 9 dernières années. Et je me réjouis de voir que la réconciliation nationale et la réforme économique ont été non seulement engagées, mais poursuivies par le président Ramos, engagées par la présidente Aquino, poursuivies par son successeur. Et je peux vous dire, à l'occasion de cet anniversaire, que la France est désireuse de participer à votre effort et ne doute pas que les liens d'amitié et de coopération entre nos deux peuples iront en se renforçant. C'est mon vœu d'anniversaire.
Absolutely no doubt that the EDSA revolution was one of the seminal events, not only in the history of the Philippines, but in the history of the 20th century, because it set in motion forces which ultimately led to the triumph of democracy in countries literally all over the world, from Pakistan to Panama, from South Korea to South Africa. People who were struggling for democracy in their own country were inspired by the triumph of people power in the Philippines. I know, having traveled very widely myself in the mid and late 1980s, that when I would go to countries, for example, like Poland, I would be greeted by leaders of Solidarność, the Polish opposition. And they would say to me, we want you to do for Poland what you helped the Filipinos to do in the Philippines. In South Africa, people felt that if the forces of democracy could triumph there, then perhaps it might be possible to secure the abolition of apartheid in their country.
Mr. President, you were imprisoned then in defiance of the communist dictatorship, and you suffered tremendously. Did people power inspire you, influence your thinking, and strengthen your lonely prison crusade for freedom?
Já jsem skutečně i v těch letech, kdy jsem byl ve vězení, years I spent in prison, I tried to follow developments in the world, although my sources of information then were even more limited than in the time when I was free. I was not in a position to know all the details, but in general terms, of course, I followed the situation in the Philippines, sided with all my heart with the revolutionary movement, feeling great sympathies for Mrs. Aquino, and I rejoice at the news that the Marcos dictatorship was overthrown. I took the revolution to be an inspiring and encouraging event, and I believe that many of my fellow citizens felt the same way. And thus it was inevitable that they drew strength from and felt sympathies with any analogous movements elsewhere that also was striving to promote democracy, to liberate human beings, and to restore respect to human rights.
The first audible people power was in the noise barrage of April 6, 1978. I say audible because we really did not see the huge crowds, but we certainly could hear all the noise. And that was the first time that people were made aware of the fact that there were so many of them already dissatisfied with the dictatorship. Prior to that, because of the censored press that we had, we really did not know how many were with us in the matter of wanting to restore democracy. Then, of course, the first visible people power was at Ninoy's funeral. And at that time, it was estimated around 2 million people took part in Ninoy's funeral. Then, of course, EDSA was the crowning glory. That after all those years of, shall I say, practice, people finally got the hang of rallies and were willing, in fact, to stand up and be counted.
And much from the success of the Filipino People Power Revolution, we thought a major cause of the success of the revolution was come from the participation of middle class. Without middle class participation, there would be no success in the Philippines. So we got a serious lesson from this Filipino case. So we strongly determined we should maintain moderate and non-violent struggle.
Congressman Sellers, you knew Ninoy Aquino and, of course, Cory Aquino intimately. Would you say that Ninoy's death at the hands of the dictatorship 3 years before EDSA triggered the events that led to that 4-day bloodless revolution and Cory Aquino's eventual accession to the presidency?
On the tarmac of Manila International Airport, as it was then called. And I think there must have been millions of Filipinos who, when that happened, said to themselves that this was simply intolerable. And I think it galvanized the potential opposition to the kleptocracy in a way that nothing else perhaps might have done. It was, of course, the great tragedy of Ninoy's life that it took his death to achieve the reestablishment of democracy to which he had devoted so much of his life as a leading advocate of human rights in the Philippines.
A funeral of Ninoy where there was a lot of gathering, the funeral of Luneta, not funeral, but big maybe that was also a funeral because a funeral of democracy, you know, that time. And it was like a proclamation that something is not right.
I see EDSA as part of a whole development since the time of Ninoy Aquino.
EDSA represents part of the journey that was preceded by many things that were happening. Even preceding the assassination. But certainly, the assassination was one major event that contributed or made possible the happening of EDSA.
To get middle class support, peaceful struggle, non-violent struggle, non-pro-commercial
The students
Well, absolutely necessary.
When Ninoy had gone to visit Nicaragua, he saw what had happened because of violence. And he was determined that the same thing should not happen to the Filipino people. He did not want the cries of widows and orphans simply because he did not think hard enough and long enough about the evils of violence. So after Nicaragua, he was absolutely convinced that it would only be through the nonviolent process that he would work in order to restore our democracy.
I remember what he said when he returned to Manila from Boston. And one of the most memorable things he said was, courage by cowardice is contagious.
Actually, Teddy, I picked that up from Ninoy, who picked it up from Gandhi. And I think, just so we will not be accused of plagiarism, I thought at first it was Ninoy who said it first, but then later on I realized, and after I had read about Gandhi, that it was he who said it first, that courage, like cowardice, is highly infectious.
9 months ago, the people of South Africa voted for and gave birth to a democratic, new, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic South Africa. 9 years ago, the heroic people of the Philippines, through their hard-fought liberation struggle, brought about a social revolution in their own country. Thousands of people were detained, tortured, and killed during this struggle. But the Philippines is enjoying the fruits of that struggle today. Our two peoples and countries have witnessed bitter hardships. Today is a day to celebrate that great victory and to look forward to a future with renewed hope and vigor for a better life for all. On behalf of the people of South Africa, I congratulate you on this 9th anniversary of the People's Revolution. God bless you.
Mr. President, the fact that you joined EDSA means that you had some deep-seated differences with the Marcos dictatorship, which had been simmering underneath for some time. Could you tell us the nature of these differences?
Well, I told you about my reformist attitudes all along. Now, the use of the troops of the armed forces, including the very strategic units like the Rangers, the Armored, the Special Forces, the paratroops, to carry out missions which to me were not germane to our legal duty, are among the basic reasons why I decided to get out of the Marcos regime on the 22nd of February 1986. I'm sure I incurred the displeasure of Mr. Marcos because as a reformist, as an officer in command of a lot of troops with reformist tendencies, I must have been on his, if not hit list, at least his uncooperative list. Now, that was manifested in many ways. I could have succeeded legitimately into the office of Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. This opportunity was not given me. But as we saw ourselves at EDSA in February 1986, we were really ready to die, prepared to die for a good cause.
Mr. President, Mrs. Corazon Aquino revealed that there was a plot on the part of RAM to seize power during EDSA, and in fact they proposed to her either to join that junta that they had prepared or for her to accept an important position. Did you know anything about that junta?
The nights of the 23rd and the 24th, there were meetings among the political leaders under the the leadership of Johnny Ponce Enrile, to talk about the future course of events. However, was not very much a part of those deliberations.
It was a civil-military junta. The way I remember it, from the civilian sector would come me and Doy Laurel, and I think it was Siling Palma and possibly Senator Tañada. Those were the civilians, I think, that were being proposed. Then, of course, from the military, you would have Eddie Ramos and Johnny Ponce Enrile. And it was Doy who had shown me the copy of the proposal, which came from the Enrile camp. When I said I would not be part of anything like that. And this is what really precipitated my taking my oath of office. Because at a certain point, I think it was Monday before, so that was the 24th, and it was being reported to me that, you know, we do not hear your name anymore being mentioned, I think by Johnny Ponce Enrile. And so the leaders of the opposition then came to see me, and I remember Senator Tañada and Senator Diokno, together with Siling Palma and Jovi Salonga and all these others, were telling me, it is now time for you to take your oath of office.
I, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, do solemnly swear
that it was an experience of first of solidarity. Rarely had we been able to come together as a people that way before, no? And then where people were willing to make any sacrifices that were necessary, where people shared their lives and their fortunes together, where they shared their food and everything that they had.
Yes, there is a grace of the moment that makes us exhilarated and makes us courageous and strong. But there is also the quiet grace, more silent. I think it is working in the hearts of people. There are, I know, people who continue to make commitments.
We should build on what the EDSA promise, and that is we should continue strengthening our democratic institutions so that what happened before EDSA and up to EDSA will not happen again.
Dr. Alfonsin, like Cory Aquino, who took over the presidency of the Philippines after the Marcos dictatorship, you took over the presidency of Argentina after a long period of Peronist governments of Juan Domingo Perón and Maria Estela Martinez, popularly known as Isabelita Perón, and the succeeding military juntas. What problems does democracy face after such a period of dictatorship?
Mr. Benigno, democracies in Latin America were established within the framework of the most severe crisis the region had ever faced, at least in this century. The second is that we took power after the dictatorship from whose rule a dirty war took place. During this dirty war, there were around 10,000 people who disappeared. Thus, while on one hand, we had to solve economic and social problems which were not easy to solve at once because of the crisis we were going through. On the other hand, we had to try these people who had broken the law and had committed human rights violations, and those people who had prevented democracy and freedom to develop. We think that in order to solve the problems the poor democracies are facing, we have to find a common denominator among the progressive sectors so that we are able to face and strive against the economic power. Because you know, the economic power is trying to solve his own problems. And as you know, this is not always easy to do. You have just mentioned Mrs. Aquino. I would like to express my satisfaction and my gratitude for being able to express my personal feelings towards the Filipino people. And I would like to remind you that when we were there in order to express our solidarity, the solidarity of one emerging democracy towards another emerging democracy. Because we were new democracies in a world which was emerging in the world of already established democracies.
Mr. President, after more than 3 years in your presidency, can you name specific measures that you have undertaken to make sure that democracy and people power have taken deep root in the Philippines?
First of all, the peace process. In my 5 major programs of government, the peace process, enhancing our national stability, peace and order in the country, and social cohesion among our people. That is the basic program of my administration. I also felt that although the EDSA People Power Revolution of 1996 brought about political empowerment for our people, and we must credit President Aquino for this, that the economic side had not yet been put in place. I'm talking about livelihood, family income, the economic recovery and growth of the Philippines itself in the company of our more vibrant and vigorous countries in Asia Pacific. And therefore, that became my own self-assigned mandate.
Contrary to what American political commentators say, I do not believe that democracy necessarily leads to development. I believe that what a country needs to develop is discipline more than democracy. The exuberance that democracy leads to ends up in undisciplined and disorderly conditions which are inimical to development.
I don't believe that. Tell that to the Japanese, who have done rather well economically within the framework of a democratic political system. Tell that to the Taiwanese, who are now a democracy, or the South Koreans. But I think that the Filipinos are in the process of demonstrating that you can be a democracy and at the same time achieve significant and sustained rates of economic growth. And that is a message which needs to be heard, understood, and acted upon throughout the world.
Kalayaan, kapayapaan, kaunlaran, tatlong hangaring nagbigay kahulugan sa ating kasaysayan at nagpatibay sa mga pinakamagagandang ugali ng Pilipino. Tulungan, kapatiran, at damayan. Mga katangiang patuloy na magpapasigla at magpapaunlad sa ating lipunan. Diwa ng Balintawak at EDSA, gawing gabay sa pag-unlad.
Your Eminence, how much of a role did God play in this 4-day outpouring of millions of Filipinos? And how much of a role did the Filipino people play? Was it a case of man proposing and God disposing?
I would say that the prayers of the people who were suffering for so many years under the martial law of Mr. Marcos cried to heaven for vengeance. And the prayers, sacrifices made God solve the problem. And that was the beginning of the revolution, when God himself inspired the people to come and be able to help those soldiers who defected from Mr. Marcos, which was considered by Mr. Marcos as treason, and treason was punishable by death. So the role of the shepherd is to save lives. So it was motivated by this kind of obligation of the shepherd of the Archdiocese of Manila to save the lives of those soldiers who defected. But it became political because Marcos left the country. So there was a change of political system. So from this desire to save the lives, it became a political issue when the government was changed. And I think prayer is the strength of man and the weakness of God. If you pray, God becomes weaker and man becomes stronger. He cannot resist people who are praying.
I have to say, first of all, I'm a great admirer of Cardinal Sin, and I get a real kick out of the fact that every time I visit him at his residence, he says, "Welcome to the House of Sin." I think that he played, and the church played, a very important role in the triumph of people power in the Philippines. It was, after all, the Cardinal who called upon the people to come out to EDSA and to defend those who had broken with the dictatorship. I think it was the deeply rooted faith of the Filipino people which must have sustained them at a moment when it was by no means clear that people's power would triumph. We have but to look at what happened at Tiananmen Square in China in 1989. We have but to look at what happened in Rangoon in Burma in 1988 to know that the military does not always refuse to fire on its own people. And it's entirely possible that EDSA could have ended up as a bloodbath with literally thousands of people having lost their lives. So it took enormous courage and great commitment on the part of the Filipino people to have put their lives on the line for democracy. And I believe their willingness to do so in a very real and profound sense was made possible by their deeply rooted faith in their God and their church.
Well, let me say categorically, without the Catholic Church, I would be nothing. I mean, I believe in the Catholic Church. I am part of the Catholic Church. And the way I see it, most Filipinos, 85% of Filipinos belong to the Catholic Church. And it is through this, what we refer to as the communion of saints, that we are all able to work together. And prayer is the ultimate power. There was never any time in my presidency when I did not call on Almighty God to help. Cory Aquino cannot possibly be without prayer. Teddy, given that I became president because of people power, during my presidency, I resolved in turn to show my gratitude to the Filipino people by empowering the people. While it is true that under my presidency, we had thousands of these NGOs, what was lacking really was the integration of all of these different NGOs, cooperatives, etc. So now, as I hope I will be forgiven by giving a plug for the Aquino Foundation, what I am endeavoring to do now is to bring together the cooperatives from all over the Philippines, and we in the Aquino Foundation hope to provide a home for all of the cooperatives in the Aquino Center, which will be established in Tarlac. My role in this, Teddy, is to be providing linkages. I thank the Filipino people for having made me president. Now I think it is my duty to bring them together.
Mr. Ambassador, you held a press conference with the foreign press immediately after EDSA, where I was present. You said the two forces that held EDSA or people power together were the Roman Catholic Church and the military. You also said the church would play a more significant role than the military in the shaping of the Philippines' future. Have subsequent events in our country proved you right?
Yeah, I think events have proved me right. I think the military's influence for too long after the People Power Revolution was a negative, destabilizing influence. Not the entire military, of course, but that small core of people who kept trying to overthrow the Aquino government. I think the military's role now is a very positive one. My impression on my recent visits to the Philippines is that the Philippine military is again a strong supporter of civilian authority, a strong supporter of the Philippine Constitution, and is a much more professional force in all ways than it was during the Marcos period and during the next few years after the Marcos regime. But I think that the church was, for a long time in the Philippines, it seemed to me that it was one of the substitutes for a civilian government in the Philippines. You know, in 1984, 1985, I used to travel quite a bit in the provinces This was at the time when the New People's Army was gaining ground, making massive conversions of people out at the barangay level. And I would go through entire provinces and see very little presence of civilian government authority. The only people present were the NPA, the military, and the church. So I think that the church's influence in the Philippines has been very considerable over the years. And I think it remains very considerable.
Mr. President, the church was largely behind the 4 days of People Power in February 1986. It was a time of cordial collaboration between the church and the military, precisely because they joined and defended those who mutinied, including Minister Enrile, you. Now that you are president, how do you address and how do you assess the role of the church in the building of the Philippines?
The church is a very important component of our society. In fact, they are a leading part of all of this. Now, I go back to EDSA because I have consistently credited 4 players as being responsible for making it all happen. First of all, a credible political leader in the person of Cory Aquino, whom I perceive to be the winner of that snap election. Second, a group of military professionals led by Enrile and Ramos, who made the immediate mutiny successful. Third, the people themselves, who rallied to support the mutineers by a very persuasive and articulate religious leader in the person of Cardinal Steve. But there is one other player that I also give credit to, and I've said this consistently all along. And this is a divine commander-in-chief who made things fall in the right place at the right time. Now, having said all of that, I hope that we shall continue to enjoy the collaboration of the church. For after all, my approach to governance is that of consensus building.
Dr. Alfonsin, you have gone through a long and grueling period of ups and downs in Argentina. In almost all third world nations, democracy faces a number of problems like widespread poverty, crime and violence, and graft and corruption. Do you have any prescription for the survival and eventual strengthening of democracy in a third world country?
There isn't just one recipe for the strengthening of democracy. It's necessarily that we have to solve many problems, but first of all we have to solve the problems of those who have the least, of the poorest. We have to fight for equality, but we need what I call the ethics of solidarity. We have to work with solidarity. Everybody has to reach and show his personal commitment. I say that democracy needs democratic subjects. With democracy, we see all the problems. In the case of a dictatorship, the problems are covered, they don't surface. But in order to have a democratic participation, we have to feel democracy or move democracy from inside towards the outside. We have to kill the authoritarianism we have inside ourselves. Democracy means more participation, and we have to fight against all evils such as violence and corruption. But I say it once again, I would like to stress this especially, democracy is not just freedom, democracy is also justice and social equality.
EDSA was the power of an idea whose time had come. People power actually was another historic milestone in the Philippines' fight for freedom. In August 1886, Andres Bonifacio and his Katipunan revolutionaries wore their cedulas during the cry of Pugadlawin against Spanish colonial tyranny. In February 1986, 100 years after millions of Filipinos stormed EDSA in another historic event, the cry against the Marcos dictatorship. Two national heroes, almost 100 years apart, triggered those two upheavals. Jose Rizal's novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, were a cri de coeur, a cry of the heart that lighted the torches of the revolution against the abuses of Spain. Benigno Aquino Jr.'s assassination at the hands of the Marcos dictatorship yielded the spiritual fuel that exploded into EDSA and people power. The first was against colonial tyranny, that of Spain. The second was against local tyranny, that of Ferdinand Marcos. With the whole world riveted on it, EDSA could not fail. And EDSA could not fail because it was a spiritual uprising as well that the world understood, reveled at, and admired. They saw the Filipino people offer prayers, flowers, and food to the advancing troops of the dictatorship. They saw the tanks stop and the soldiers smile. They saw the guns were silent. They saw many generals desert President Marcos. The people never backed down an inch. In no time, the entire coercive panoply that supported the dictatorship collapsed.
Now, I hope to be able to devote the last 2 years of my term towards really making the political, social, and economic empowerment of our people really take off, so that whoever would be sitting here in my position as the president, this would take place on a sustainable basis and will not be undermined or undone by the actions of a future president, because they are there permanently as laws of the land. For me, the crowning glory of my public service is to be able to do what I have to do to contribute to our democracy during my watch as president, and then later on to be down there as one of the ordinary crowd to applaud.
If there's another dictator in the making here in our country, I'll be back to the streets. I'll be back marching in the streets again.
I'm doing my part. I'm doing it through cooperativism, which is what I believe in. And cooperativism, I think, is just another way of people power.
I personally have given up my green card after EDSA. I had a green card. I gave it up after the coup when I told myself, EDSA still needs to, EDSA still needs the followers that it had before. So sabi ko, dito na lang ako sa Pilipinas.
I plan to make social work and NGO work the main direction in my life.
There was a transformation from being a very young, reformist-minded officer in the military then to a still, I guess, a reformist-minded police officer now. But I had to go through a lot of ups and downs, getting involved in previous two major coups in 87 and 89, and getting incarcerated or detained in the process of fighting for what I thought would help bring about change in our society.
Since the Filipinos have such short memories, everybody's back in town. It's the same as usual. But I think what you experience in EDSA is something that you will remember forever. And I think it's also people now, like for the elections, and the Filipinos will say, don't waste EDSA.
And so today, on this 9th anniversary of the EDSA Revolution, we join you in commemorating those whose sacrifice made people power possible. We join you in applauding the restoration of your representative institutions. We take this opportunity to celebrate with you our renewed partnership and our shared commitment to democratic ideals.
Your Eminence, could there be a second EDSA?
If something happens, I think this will repeat itself.
It's part of the Filipino life. It has become second nature to us, that we know now what we can accomplish through people power, and also we know that this is the only peaceful way, you know, to seek changes or to seek reforms.
The road now is not a straight road. Actually, it's still zigzaggy. It's full of thorns and barriers. The road is not easy, as I see it, in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years. But we're moving on. Now, should my assistance be necessary on the call of the leaders then at that time, I'll be very happy to provide it as an elder statesman or as a senior citizen, so to speak. But the EDSA 2 that I'm seeing is really Philippines 2000.
EDSA's gift to the Filipino people was the restoration of democracy. And yet, the tasks that remain to be accomplished are immense and daunting. Democracy brought back freedom. But the Philippines remains an impoverished third world country. The church and the state are often at loggerheads on the issues of family planning and public morality. There is a painful striving by each to seek common ground. If they don't, the results could be disastrous. What is missing is an ignition system that can advance the Philippines faster, economically, socially, and politically. The economy has to be fast-tracked. Selfish patronage politics has to be subdued. Corruption has to be tamed. Rampaging crime and violence will have to be stopped in their tracks. These are enormous tasks, but they have to be addressed urgently and with dispatch. There is a search for a new moral order in this only Christian country in Asia. The church has clearly the ascendancy over the state in this matter. The recent papal visit of Pope John Paul II underscores this in dramatic terms. 4 million people, the largest human gathering ever recorded in modern history, turned out for the Pope's outdoor Mass last January 15. As a spectacle, it was incredible. We are a nation with a short memory. Were it not for the fact that we just commemorated the 50th anniversary of the terrible massacre and destruction of Manila at the end of World War II, we almost forgot it happened. National unity and progress can only be forged if we reach into our heroic past. That past must inspire us. It must bring forth a new breed of Filipino heroes. We must never forget the Katipunero and his Rayadillo, People Power, and the Yellow Army. Jose Rizal, Andres Bonifacio, Apolinario Mabini, Ninoy Aquino. The price of freedom, as it has always been, is eternal vigilance. We Filipinos must never forget that if we faltered or stumbled in the recent past, it is because we virtually forgot our noble heritage, our heroes, their selfless deeds. We have to be reminded again and again that millions of Filipinos died in the continuing struggle for freedom. And today, the 9th anniversary of EDSA, we remember. We must always remember.
The general belief, the knowledge that we can do it, that the people have power, I think that has perdured.
It's nice to see that in the Philippines, young people especially have a chance to set up their own businesses, have a chance to really start their own lives, start doing things that they can really do without being afraid of having their businesses controlled. And I think that's really good for the country.
Kaya yung diwa ng EDSA, hindi na ako magsasalita para sa iba, pero para sa akin, ay nandito pa sa aking palagayan. Sa paniniwala ko na, una, halimbawa, na hindi pa natin kilala ang Pinoy. Maraming maganda sa Pinoy. Maraming mga kabutihan, kabayanihan, kagandahan na hindi pa natin nakikita.
I know a lot of young people who volunteer and contribute to do something to make life more human. I think that's EDSA for me.
I think that the spiritual legacy of EDSA has remained.
If we could be very, very responsible for what we say, what we do, what we write in media, because it's really something very, very important.
I always remember that whatever freedom I enjoy now, whatever privileges I enjoy now, is a result of that one brave step that Mrs. Aquino and the Filipino people took 9 years ago.
I will continue to have boundless hope in the youth of the Philippines and of the world. Christ is working through them for a new springtime of Christianity in this continent. I take with me 1,000 images of the Filipino people. I know you desire for greater justice and a better life for yourselves and your children. No one can underestimate the difficulties you face and the hard work that lies ahead.
I think the story of EDSA needs to be told, needs to be understood, needs to be reflected on, and needs to serve as both a mirror and a searchlight. A mirror to show us what we became then and what we have become now, and a searchlight to show us what we can be.
Pagkadalisay at pagkadakila